The cold wind howled through the empty fields when Clara's screams were swallowed by the night. Her wrists were raw, bound with coarse rope to the wooden fence post, and her tear-streaked face trembled under the laughter of the bullies. They had come for her again, this time, not just with words or shoves, but with cruelty sharp enough to scar a soul. The small-town men, who never forgave her for marrying a man from outside their circle, thought tying her to a fence like some helpless animal would teach her her place. But what they didn't know was that Clara's husband was not a man to forgive or forget. And the storm he carried inside was far deadlier than the night wind that chilled her bones. Clara was no stranger to hardship. Raised on the family farm, she had been mocked her whole life for being too quiet, too plain, and too stubborn. But those same traits made her resilient. She had met James, a former Marine, when he came into town years ago looking for peace after years of war. He wasn't rich, but his heart was steady, and his love for Clara was fierce and unyielding. The townsfolk, jealous of their bond and resentful of outsiders, turned their bitterness into cruelty. James ignored them at first, but Clara often became their target. She told him not to fight for her, not to start trouble. "We'll outlive their hate," she whispered. But that night, when they tied her to the fence, everything changed. The bullies thought it was a game. They jeered, threw mud, and called her names, leaving her bound as the temperature dropped. Hours passed before James returned home from the mill and found the house empty, the lamp still burning. Panic tore through him. He called her name across the fields until his throat burned, and when he heard her weak cries carried by the wind, something inside him snapped. The sight of Clara, shivering and broken, wrists bleeding against the ropes, was seared into his soul. He cut her free with trembling hands, wrapped her in his coat, and held her as she sobbed. But as his arms comforted her, his mind was already on fire with vengeance. The next day, Clara begged him to let it go. "James, please, don't bring more pain. I just want peace." But he could not forget the fear in her eyes, the humiliation etched into her skin. James had lived through deserts of war, had seen men at their ugliest, and he knew monsters only stopped when someone made them. That night, he sat in silence at the kitchen table, sharpening an old hunting knife, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Clara knew the man she loved was no longer asking for permission. He was preparing for war. James didn't strike blindly. He watched, waited, and learned. The bullies bragged openly in the tavern, boasting about what they'd done to the farm girl and her soldier husband. James memorized every name, every face. He knew their schedules, their weaknesses. When the time came, he moved like a shadow through the town. One by one, he confronted them. The rope bit into Clara's skin, digging so deep she could feel her pulse fighting against the coarse fibers. The men around her roared with laughter, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight as they mocked the quiet little farm girl. They had always hated her, her silence, her strength, her unwillingness to bow to their cruelty. But this time, they wanted more than to humiliate her. They wanted to break her. She was tied to a fence like livestock, cold and trembling, with only the echo of their laughter as company. Clara had been bullied before, but never like this. And what they didn't know was that the love she shared with her husband James would soon become their undoing. Clara had grown up working harder than most men in town. From dawn until dusk, her days were filled with plowing fields, tending livestock, and carrying burdens heavier than her frame seemed built for. Yet she never complained. The same people who ridiculed her strength secretly envied it, and when she married James, their jealousy only grew. James wasn't from their world, he was a battle-hardened Marine, a man who had seen war and returned home to build peace. The townsfolk whispered that he didn't belong, that Clara had betrayed her roots by marrying him. And so, every cruel joke, every shove in the market, every whisper behind her back grew darker over time, until that night at the fence. When James found Clara tied there, his heart broke and burned at once. He had seen his brothers in arms fall in battle, he had seen innocents harmed in war zones, but nothing had ever filled him with rage like seeing his wife treated as prey in her own hometown. He carried her home in his arms, every step a vow that he would never let her suffer alone again. Clara clung to him, shivering, whispering through broken sobs, "Don't fight them, James, promise me you won't fight." But he couldn't promise her that. His silence that night was louder than any words. The next day, Clara's bruises told a story the sheriff refused to hear. The men responsible had wealthy fathers, old family names, and influence in the town. They walked free, laughing, while Clara was told to forget it and move on. James's jaw tightened with every word. He had risked his life overseas for the idea of justice, and now, in his own backyard, justice was a lie. He began to watch the men, learning their habits, studying their weaknesses. For James, war wasn't something left behind. War lived in him, and now it had purpose. The first man to feel James's wrath was a drunkard named Roy, one of the ringleaders. Roy swaggered home from the tavern one night, only to find himself face down in the dirt, his arms pinned behind him. James whispered into his ear, "Did it feel like power to tie my wife to a fence?" The man shook with terror, unable to answer. James tied him to his own front porch, leaving him bound until dawn, humiliated in front of the neighbors. Word spread quickly, the Marine wasn't sitting idle. But with